Clock, so we'll be precise, Renee. We have to be, right, with what we
Right.
do. All right, so good evening, everybody, and so glad that you could join us tonight for a very important discussion on voting with a huge election, as we know, on the horizon in November. So much is riding on this vote, and so much is riding on how we vote that it's also become a political issue. I'm Rachel Platt, the Director of Community Engagement at the Frazier History Museum. I am co-moderating this discussion tonight with a woman I have so admired on TV. With her smarts, her tenacity to get answers, we welcome Renee Shaw from KET's Kentucky Tonight. Hey, Renee.
Hello, Rachel. Thank you. I'm fangirling over you too, because I've admired you for many years, and it's so nice to split these duties tonight. So thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. We're going to introduce our panelists in just a moment. Tonight, we're also talking about the importance of voting. That's why the title of tonight's program is, What is a Vote Worth? It's also the name of the new exhibit at the Frazier History Museum, What is a Vote Worth? Suffrage Then and Now, commemorating the centennial of the 19th Amendment and the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act.
And when you ask what is a vote worth, think of the countless suffragists who fought for more than 70 years for women to get that right to vote, and some of the most notable names dying before they ever won the right to cast a ballot.
And think of the countless African-American women who had to fight even longer, wait even longer for hurdles like literacy tests and poll taxes to be outlawed with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we enter tonight's discussion with all of that history top of mind, knowing that the system is still a work in progress, with a healthy discussion of what is working and what isn't, and where we can all kind of agree on change.
And before we introduce our panelists, we want the audience out there on Zoom to know we're going to be asking you all several survey questions tonight to help inform our discussion as we go along. We have about 5 questions. We're going to get to those in just a few minutes, and very simple questions with yes, no, or undecided. So be prepared to start answering those questions momentarily. Renee?
So first, our panel, Secretary of State Michael Adams, who's made headlines for his compromise, Democratic Governor Andy Beshear, on the voting plan for the general election. He's received praise and blowback. Also on the panel, a good friend of Secretary Adams, UK law professor Joshua Douglas. If you follow those guys on Twitter, they constantly ham it up. Professor Douglas teaches and researches voting rights and election laws. He's also the author of the book, which I highly recommend you read, called Vote for Us: How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting.
Also joining us, Rick Green, the editor of the Courier Journal, as well as Sadiqa Reynolds, the president of Louisville's Urban League. And finally, we have Amina, Elahi with Louisville Public Media. We thank you all for rounding out this really great panel. Tonight's program is sponsored by Louisville Public Media, the National Council of Jewish Women, Louisville section, Wells Fargo, and our community partner is Lean Into Louisville.
So Secretary of State Michael Adams, let's start with you, and let's have you first lay out the compromise that you reached with the governor. It breaks down into 3 stages. You can vote by mail, you can early vote, or do in person. So the first part allows folks to vote by mail, though you do need an excuse. Anyone can use COVID as the excuse, correct?
That's right. Thank you, Rachel, Renee, all of you for joining tonight. I think in the interest of time, I'll just explain what's changed since our primary in June. The governor and I were both very pleased with how our primary went. We had very high turnout for a primary, but no spike in COVID-19 cases following it, despite hundreds of thousands of people voting in person in that primary. We became a national example other states have looked to, celebrated around the country as the state that was highly competent in running an election during a pandemic. I'm very proud of that, just having been here 8 months on the job. We tried to keep the best of what worked, and I think you'll see that in the options voters have to vote, but we've also made some changes that we thought were meritorious to try to get us closer to a normal election. One thing people were frustrated about, myself included, is we didn't have more locations for in-person voting. That wasn't a feature, that was a bug. We had more poll worker volunteers on March 6th, the day the first COVID-19 case was diagnosed in Kentucky, than we had on March 20th, the deadline to register to be a poll worker. The governor and I used our executive powers to toll that date twice into April and May. It just didn't work. It was hard to find poll workers. We've had much more success getting poll workers this time, and we're going to have more locations for in-person voting. We're also going to have an extra week of early voting in person, 3 weeks, unlike 2 in the primary. So number one, we're going to have more in-person voting opportunities. And number two, we're going to have faster results. Pretty much every state that's voted since the 1st of April or so has had to wait a week or longer to count their votes because of a reliance on absentee voting. We're still going to have absentee voting available for people who perceive that they need it. We're not going to discriminate on any particular health condition or age. We let the voter make that subjective decision. But by offering more in-person opportunities and also requiring our clerks to zero out their machines and count their ballots they've received as of the close of the polls, we think we'll go from about 25% of the vote counted on election night in the primary to maybe 75% counted on election night in November. It won't be all the votes, but it'll be a lot and maybe enough to call some races.
And so they do have to be postmarked by November 3rd, right? Those absentee ballots. And then you hope to start counting them and have that reported out by the 6th. Is that correct?
Yeah, we've got a hard date to receive it by the 6th. We've got to have some deadline. We have to have finality at some point. But something that we're doing a little differently programmatically, the voters won't really see much of a difference, is we opened the portal much earlier this time. Last time we had to build the thing from scratch. We only had about a month to utilize it. This time we opened it up in August. We opened it earlier. We've already had about 250,000 Kentuckians take advantage of the absentee ballot request portal at govoteky.com. But we're also going to close it earlier. We're closing October 9th. The reason for that is now we can help our clerks handle the absentee phase of this election and then finish that processing and then pivot to the early voting phase of the election. We're also, the governor and I, going to encourage voters not just to get their ballot sooner, but also to vote it sooner if they're comfortable. If they don't know who they're going to vote for, then they should take their time. But if they've made up their minds, they can go ahead and get those in. And the sooner that we get them in, the faster they can be processed and the earlier we'll have more results.
All right, Michael, wanted to, we talked about the success of the primary. It was the highest voter turnout for a Kentucky primary since 2008. So obviously the mail-in voting was a big success. Josh, let's get your reaction to it first with mail-in voting. COVID is an excuse that you can use. Is that easy enough when you do need an excuse, at least for the mail-in?
Yeah, I think so. And I think what's great is that the governor and the Secretary of State emphasize that it's the voters' subjective belief as to whether they need to express that COVID-19 is a valid excuse. And in fact, when you use the portal, you don't have to select among the various possible excuses like being out of the county on election day or some other sort of reason. You simply are certifying that you qualify under one of the ones that are listed, and they're all listed there. And I think it's very important. If any voter feels uncomfortable with respect to the pandemic because they may be in contact with someone who's more vulnerable or they themselves are more vulnerable, they can request an absentee ballot. So, although formally the law remains as it's an excuse required, the functional reality is that anyone in Kentucky qualifies for an absentee ballot if they subjectively believe that COVID-19 is a valid excuse for them. And that's just great news for Kentucky voters.
And we'll talk about moving down the line about no excuse and that kind of thing. Sadiqa, weigh in. Are you pleased with the plan, especially when it comes to the absentee?
We are pleased with the plan. I mean, obviously every plan could be improved, but we actually had filed litigation and dismissed it by agreement. So obviously we did find there were things in there that worked for us. And I think that I do applaud the Secretary of State and the governor for being able to reach a compromise. Obviously there are things that we wish we could see Kentucky do better. We always want to be number one in the country as opposed to one of the, but again, I think I don't like to be too critical when you do have things to celebrate. But there are certainly things that we do need to talk about. And I don't know if this is the time or if you'd like to talk later, but if you ask me if I'm pleased, the answer is pleased enough to have dismissed the lawsuit. Right, Secretary Adams?
We're going to get to some of those other things as far as issues that you want to talk about in just a second. Renee, now you go ahead because I know the other folks want to jump in.
So our journalists on the panel, Amina and Rick, I want you guys to weigh in. Amina, if you'll go first, and just from what you've written about and heard from voters about the voting process, what do you think about the compromise that was struck between Adams and the governor?
I think there's definitely some measure of relief amongst a lot of Kentucky voters who were concerned either because they had trouble accessing the polls last time, because they felt like too much change would be difficult to adapt to, and because, as I'm sure we'll discuss, there's so much politicization around this upcoming election and the way that it's going to be handled in terms of absentee voting and the post office or the postal service and all of these issues that we've been hearing about. I think the fact that there are different options and you're not necessarily limited to something that you may not feel comfortable with, I think that is going to be something to instill confidence in a lot of Kentucky voters.
Rick, your take.
Sure. What an unexpected victory for voters. I'll be real honest with you. I've been monitoring and been part of newspapers and newsrooms in Ohio and California, Iowa, New Jersey before coming here to Kentucky. And never could understand some of the restrictions with some of the voting in Kentucky. That 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. never really settled well with me, but it was so fascinating for me to be able to see a rookie Secretary of State strike a deal with a rookie governor, different parties, in this heated environment where bipartisanship is almost a curse word in political circles. It was great from our standpoint to be able to see that the voters came first. And granted, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, but I felt that there was a lot of courage in the face of a lot of upheaval, particularly in the national circles, where Secretary of State probably won't be getting some fruit baskets for some folks in his party this year because of this decision. And I think that's fine. You know, we've been hearing for the past 60 years that there's never been an election more important than what we're getting ready to face, right? Generational change in 60, and the heels of the tumultuous 1968, post-Watergate in 76, post-terror in 2004, and obviously 2016 and 2020, we've all heard the importance of this election. I think this is good. This is good for the Commonwealth in the face of a global pandemic that has swept through the Commonwealth and unfortunately claimed almost 1,000 lives and has just changed our lives as we've known it. I thought it was a great win for the voters of our Commonwealth. And I really salute the Secretary of State and the governor for being able to find this common ground and making this happen.
We're going to talk about some of that blowback coming up, Secretary Adams, in just a moment, but we kind of want to get the audience involved right now. Technically, you do need an excuse for this mail-in ballot, but we want to talk about moving forward after this. So here is our first question for our audience. If you're on Zoom, you can answer this. Would you be in favor of Kentucky making permanent early in-person voting and no excuse absentee voting? You can vote yes, no, or undecided. Our panelists, you cannot vote on this, but we'll go ahead and let our audience weigh in on this question number one. Then we're going to take a look at the results and have you all react to it and see what it's going to look like in Kentucky moving forward after COVID. So we'll see if the results are in. She's got to take that down. Thank you, LaPrecious. She's back there working. All right, so here are the results. Would you be in favor of Kentucky making permanent early in-person voting and no excuse absentee ballots? Yes, 87%, no 7%, undecided 7%. So let's get reaction to that. Are those results a surprise to you, Secretary Adams, or what you would expect?
From this audience, no, I'm not surprised. I think if you were to poll a wider cross section, it would be a little more narrow. I forgot which of you said this earlier. It's unfortunate it's been politicized. There's nothing inherently Republican about in-person voting. There's nothing inherently Democratic about absentee voting. It doesn't really make a difference. Utah is a vote by mail state. So it's unfortunate that people bring in, unfortunately, some freight of thinking that if you're having a no excuse system, an early voting system, an absentee-based system, that it favors Democrats automatically. There's just no rationale for that. I think people vote the same way regardless. I think in Kentucky, the people that disproportionately will vote absentee this time will be seniors. Seniors tend Republican. They're the most Republican voting group. So in terms of the cross section of the state, I think it'd be closer to 50-50, maybe a narrow tip to absentee. But I'll note this. This was a big surprise to me. I really got my clock cleaned and still get it cleaned on making absentee voting available for this election this year. But the biggest surprise to me this year was in the June primary, about 85% of Democrats voted by absentee ballot, which wasn't that big a surprise, but 60% of Republicans did too. In the polling I've seen, it's been that the vast majority of independents and Democrats like absentee voting, and 2-to-1 Republicans are against it. But somehow we were able to persuade 3 out of 5 Republicans to vote absentee too. So that's somewhat encouraging to me as someone who's trying to rebuild his political career, that I'm able to hopefully persuade Republicans that there's nothing awry about this. We had the cleanest election in memory. We didn't have a single case of vote fraud come out of our primary despite the reliance on absentee balloting.
And I did want to ask you, Secretary Adams, are you going to push lawmakers in the 2021 session to make some of these ideas permanent?
There are some things I do want to make permanent. One thing I want to make permanent is the portal. I think everyone likes the portal. It takes burden off the clerks. It makes things easier for the voter, not just the ease of applying for a ballot, but also the ability to track your ballot the way you track an Amazon package. I think that's pretty amazing. I also want to have permanent legislation to expand whether hours or days to vote. I think 6 to 6 is a little arbitrary. It's from an agrarian era that we don't live in anymore. I'd also like to see us have permanent a cure method. The first time we've ever done ballot cure for absentee ballots has been this year. I'd like to make that permanent. I'm not prepared yet to say how far I'm willing to go. I want to have conversations with the legislature first. They're pretty angry at me for making it safe to vote in a pandemic. So I'm not especially optimistic today about how much more we can get from them.
Yeah, and we'll come back to some of that in a minute. But Sadiqa, I wanted to ask you about how do you feel about no excuse absentee voting, and moving forward, would you want to see that being made permanent?
Oh, without a doubt. Absolutely. I think it's so important when we talk about access. I talked earlier about the fact that on the burden on the nonprofit organizations as it relates to transportation. If you think about seniors that need help getting to the polls, not just in this pandemic, of course, and that's really, everybody is taking a risk as we, drive folks to the polls. You've got to think about the exposure in the vehicles and that kind of thing. But also long term, we absolutely need to make voting as accessible as possible. And I think to Secretary Adams' point, you have Utah that is a mail-in state, Oregon. I mean, they have plenty of participation. There's no reason for us not to continue, particularly when you see the numbers and the success that we had. Why would you ever go backward? I mean, this is the one thing that I can say about this pandemic. It has exposed a lot of flaws in all of the systems in our country. And to the extent that we are able to create processes that make life easier, we should continue to do those things. I hope we don't move backward as we heal from this pandemic.
Josh, what is the argument against then? When we're saying this and we're hearing this and everybody says, why would we go back? What is the argument against it then?
Well, I think in large part it's political. Politicians are the ones that dictate our voting rules, and most politicians, or many politicians, are focused on keeping the status quo because that's what they were elected under. That's what they won, and it's sort of scary for them to change the rules and fear that changing the rules could ultimately lead to their not winning the next election. Unfortunately, as has already been mentioned, our voting rights laws are so fraught with partisan bickering. We're the only developed democracy that elects partisan elected officials to run our elections. Most other places have nonpartisan election professionals do it, and it's in some ways it's crazy. It's like, I'm a big baseball fan. It's like the New York Yankees getting to choose who the umpire is every year, and then maybe another year the Boston Red Sox get to choose instead. Everyone would say that doesn't make any sense. Now, when Secretary Adams came into office and he and I chatted, what I told him is that, I think there are some Secretary of States in the country that are very clear partisans for their side on both the Democratic and the Republican side. And there are examples of Secretary of States who really treat their job as professionals and take their partisan hat off. And I'm pleased in his tenure so far to say that, in my view, that he's been of that ilk where he's, I think, taken his partisan hat off and really focused on the voters. And, one thing I want to point out is that traditionally, Kentucky is one of the worst states when it comes to voting rights. Rick mentioned this. In a nonpartisan academic study of all 50 states with a bunch of metrics in terms of how accessible is the voting process, how fair, how inclusive, Kentucky ranked number 43 in the country. It's called the Election Performance Index. And That's because we have a 29-day voter registration deadline. By the way, make sure you go to govotky.com before October 5th and check your registration. We have, a lot of states have much shorter registration deadlines. We have an excuse required to vote absentee in normal years, and the types of excuses are fairly narrow. We have only 12 hours of in-person voting, and those measures lead us down a path where we're among the worst group of states in the country. But the rules for 2020 have been so much better that I suspect we'll jump a bunch in that index because we've made the election process so much more inclusive. I think the arguments against it are hard, especially when you have people ensuring that they're looking for fraud, that they're providing fail-safe mechanisms in the system to check signatures, to check to make sure the election is full of integrity. I think it's a hard argument to go against a lot of these measures. Now, on the poll, one thing that's important to note is that there's different kinds of vote by mail, right? So Utah, Oregon, California, Colorado have universal vote, what I call universal vote by mail, where they mail every voter a ballot. I think that system works. I know that it's probably a long shot in the short term for Kentucky, but when we make it easier to vote by giving everyone a ballot automatically, more people participate. Then you have the no excuse absentee balloting state. They're here, anyone can request a mail-in ballot. That's essentially what we had in June and functionally what we have for November. And that's a great system sort of in the middle because it gives the ability for anyone to request a ballot. So I think we need to make sure we talk about the different kinds of vote by mail. And add Arizona, by the way, not a blue state. Arizona, over 75% of the ballots in Arizona are vote by mail ballots because the people have simply requested them, given that you don't need an excuse there.
But real quickly, Secretary Adams, you're not in favor of sending out universal ballots like California, Utah did. And you've said that they've created a wild, wild west, essentially.
Well, I think they should pick what works for them, but I don't think that's a good model for us for one primary reason, which is we have voter rolls that still have nearly 400,000 people on them that need to come off. I don't mean through some sort of sinister mass purge, but by law, we're supposed to maintain our rolls every 2 years. They've not been maintained since 2009. That's the last time they were adequately maintained. That's a finding of a federal judge sitting in Frankfurt. It's one of the issues I ran on. So I don't think the voters would have confidence in our system if we mailed ballots out to 400,000 people that we don't think should be on our rolls.
All right, let's get Amina and to weigh in on this. As far as, we've turned heads recently in Kentucky for all the right reasons. When it comes to those things that we've done, and you said unexpected, Rick, I would like to pick up on that word that you said a little bit ago. You said, boy, this was an unexpected good thing that happened. Weigh in on it and what your readers and listeners are telling you all.
Well, I don't think it was a secret at all. It was the Tower of Doom leading up into this election, right? There were national media outlets that had pretty much presumed that this was not going to be a success, that people were not going to come out, that there were going to be hiccups and hurdles that frankly didn't happen. And so it was, to me, as the editor of the largest media site in the Commonwealth, it was great to see some of these media outlets have to eat a little crow and acknowledge the fact that this was an election that was very successful from a voter standpoint. Listen, you can look at this from a Republican standpoint and the intensity of the Democrats and people tweeting that are in White Houses and everything else. What I believe more than anything, Rachel, is that it's going to the polls or casting your ballots, however that we are doing it, is the oxygen that keeps this democracy alive. And I think all of us have to acknowledge the fact that, yes, the pandemic did change some things for us, but it opened up so many people's eyes in terms of what was possible, as opposed to fearing what wasn't possible and to dwell on the negativity of the whole thing. It was an unexpected surprise because I think politicians put their egos aside and they put the voters first. And that's something that doesn't happen often enough in our Commonwealth or any other state around the country. So we just have got to think about how do we make as many people as possible be able to go and cast their ballot, however they do it, as we head into November's election. I just think it's absolutely integral for not only the sustainability of what we have here in Kentucky, but around the country in this democracy.
Amina, would you like to weigh in as well? Final word on that one?
Sure. I'll just add briefly, Secretary Adams, I don't know if you even remember this, but we sat down for an interview before the election, And I remember one of the questions I asked you was why we need to have a Secretary of State who's affiliated with a political party. And what I remember of your response was that you didn't really feel like it was necessary. It's our system, and that's how it works right now. But what I've seen of your actions in terms of this deal is that you stayed true to what you told me then, over a year ago, which is that that it's about making the right decisions and getting the most people access to voting. And so I've been pleased to see that come through.
Thank you very much. I don't remember saying that. I should probably recount it. But thank you.
But I do hope that Kentucky gets to a place of trying to move toward an automatic mail-in ballot. I think whatever we have to do to the voter polls to make sure that we've got some accuracy, whether that's lining that up with driver's license. I don't know how exactly, but other states have done it and it works, and it shouldn't be hard to allow people to vote. I mean, any obstacle, even with the mail-in ballots at the Urban League, we spent hours on the phones trying to help people who did not have internet access, trying to help them make sure that they were able to request a ballot. And I understand and appreciate the comments about that system, really being pieced together pretty quickly within a month's time. And so I understand the challenges. That being said, the fundamental right to vote is so important that you cannot run into those kinds of obstacles, especially when the people who are running into those obstacles are the people who have the most obstacles in their lives already. And I don't know if we're supposed to be all happy on this panel, but let's be clear, we cannot underestimate the challenges to those that I represent at the Urban League and people in our community. I mean, let's not pretend that everything has just been fine as it relates to voting. So having to request that mail-in ballot was just another obstacle for people who didn't have the internet access at a time in a pandemic when they couldn't walk into the library and use a computer. They couldn't come into the nonprofits to use a computer. So we really did struggle. It did get easier, but it was a challenge. And again, the challenges are just another pile-on for people who are already exhausted by life circumstances. And unfortunately, I mean, we just keep seeing that. So whatever we've done right, we should hold on to. But I would love to encourage Secretary Adams and all of us to really push our state forward so that we do replicate what Oregon, what Utah, those sorts of those states have, because clearly it does work for them.
What I thought I heard Secretary Adams say was that once we clean up our voter rolls, he's all for universal vote by mail. So,
did you? All right, Secretary, you weigh in on that.
Well, let me be very clear. There's different ways to make this simpler and easier for voters. You get more bang for your buck with extended early in-person voting. I'll give you a specific example. After the primary, I surveyed the clerks and asked them, what do you want to do for November? What do you think? All the decisions I've made, I've gone out of my way to speak to as many of the county clerks as possible because they actually run these elections on the ground. And half of them said that they're okay with no excuse absentee. Half of them were vehemently against it. But every single one of them, of the 70 who replied, of 120, every single one liked early voting in person. It's something it's easy to do. It's something they already do to some extent for absentee voters under usual practices. You get a lot more bang for your buck. It's much less expensive than handling the postage and other costs, printing and so forth that you get when you have a mail-in or an absentee ballot voting system. So in terms of changes, if people want it to be easier to vote, my recommendation is tell your legislator and they say, okay, well, what do you want to do? You're a lot likelier to get success pushing for in-person early voting than you are for expanded mail or absentee voting. I've actually spoken with a member of leadership in the Senate about possibly putting through an early voting bill. I don't know how much traction it'll get, but there are conversations already happening. But the clerks are pretty influential on this stuff. They like early voting as long as it's funded. It's not fair to them to bear all these costs. The reason we had expanded absentee and early voting in person is Congress paid for it. Congress sent us a big check. This was federally subsidized. The federal government paid for the vast majority of our election costs. So let's be honest, this stuff costs money. We have to cut something else to pay for it or raise taxes. So I think you get a lot more bang for the buck going with expanded hours or days for voting than you do going with a mail-in system.
But can I just say this? I'm sorry, but as a nonprofit leader, and we pay for the rides. The people pay for the rides, and we get no money from any of that. And nor do we see any money being spent to really get the word out to the poorest people, to let them know that we have early voting. There are so many people who are really disenfranchised in our community and in this country. So those two places, the marketing of it all, and then the transportation even for early voting, I think is important, because in this case, especially, we cannot ignore what's happening on the national scene with the post office. So what I am telling people is to get the ballot early, but then we've still got to get you somewhere to drop it off. You cannot trust the post office at this time.
Well, so let me weigh in if it's okay.
Yeah.
A couple things. First, the statistics from Secretary Adams on early voting are interesting and perhaps a little surprising, because what we know prior to the pandemic is that early voting actually doesn't move the needle in terms of turnout all that much, at least not in a pandemic world. In the states that have expanded early voting, the turnout effect is actually pretty small. Now, that might be different post-COVID, right? I think it was probably different for June. It might be different for November. But I think that's something that we have to think about is, are the resources best used there? Or are we going to go back to a world after, the pandemic is over where early voting doesn't move the needle as much in a regular election? And in terms of the registration issues, we can look at what other states do. For example, 21 states have same-day voter registration, where voters can show up to the polls and register and vote at the same time. This actually helps clean the voter rolls, because sometimes the voter rolls have misinformation from people's own addresses or whatnot. In addition, about a dozen, maybe 15 states have automatic voter registration, where the state automatically uses information from the DMV. These are things that also cost money, right? I don't think we can move to same-day registration unless we improve the technology that county clerks have to process those new registrations that come in 29 days before the election. But 21 states have done this and have done this successfully. And we know that the states that have same-day registration have the highest turnout. So there are various things we can do to sort of try to solve the problems of the registration list that Secretary Adams is mentioning, and also, use our dollars the best, which is obviously a difficult issue. What we do know, as Sadiqa mentioned, is that every step that we ask a voter to take, especially in our poorer and our minority communities, is every hurdle that a voter has to take and jump over is another reason why they may not show up. I mean, they may not participate.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Secretary Adams, I do want to get to you and ask you, what do you think about same-day registration? And we were going to pivot to talk about that now there's 3 weeks worth of early voting for the general, as opposed to 2 weeks in the June primary, and the benefit you think that may have on voter participation. To Joshua's point, maybe it doesn't move the needle much, but Tennessee, we know, has 10-day early voting, and they seem to have relatively, modest voter participation. So your first thought about same-day registration, and then just real quickly comment on the early voting.
Yeah, so I should probably note that everything that we've done this year has been through my use of emergency powers. None of this is permanent. I turn back into a pumpkin when this election is over. We don't have an election next year, and in 2022, I'm sure we'll be back to normal in society. And so we'll go back to the default election system that we already had, unless the legislature changes something. With regard to same-day voter registration, I certainly agree with having a shorter window between the cutoff to register to vote and the election day. I actually ran a bill in the legislature this past session to tighten that window, allow more time for people to register to vote. I think 28 days is unnecessarily long a period, a window to close the books before the election. I'm not sure that it's feasible to do same day unless we have an upgrade in technology. I would want to ensure that we had a way to verify factually that the voter who is registering on our state has not voted in some other state first. I don't know technologically how we do that. That's the concern I have, is how do we make sure this person hasn't already voted in some other state? For early voting, this is something I think is kind of low-hanging fruit for people that want to make elections easier. I've got no ideological objection to it whatsoever, but to be clear, it has to be funded. And it's pretty bleak right now in Frankfurt. My office has been defunded. I get no taxpayer dollars. Effective this past July 1, I'm living off a savings account of fee payments from corporations in prior years. it's pretty dire. So my hope is that the revenue picture will improve, but we can't really have conversations until we see that. To put this into perspective, already our state's been defunding elections for a long time. When I was on the State Board of Elections before I was in this position, I had the sad duty of voting to send money to the counties that was beneath the formula that's in state statute. Each budget, the legislature suspends that formula and says, here's less money. So we're already not paying our freight and keeping the counties whole as they pay for poll workers and other expenses for our elections.
Want to move forward. When we talked about the blowback that you were getting, I want to bring up the tweet that the governor sent out and that you responded to as well. So the governor basically said this is reprehensible, cannot be tolerated for Kentucky Secretary of State and his team to be threatened. And you said, I want to assure all Kentuckians that my family and I are just fine and face no credible imminent threat. First of all, what threats did you receive? And is this where we are in society because of voting, that it has turned into such a hot potato that there is blowback and threats, and what is going on? That's a lot to throw at you, Secretary, but let's start with threats. And then were you surprised by it?
A little, yeah. I got death threats when I was in private practice too. So unfortunately, that's just part of being in politics. So people take it way too personally. And so I'm kind of, I wouldn't say used to it, so it gets my attention. But to be clear, these threats come from both sides. It's the far left and the far right. The death threats that were phoned into the State Board of Elections, those came primarily from the left. In the wake of Hillary Clinton and LeBron James and others attacking our elections in the weekend or so before Election Day, those were phoned in from people on the left from New York and California. The story that I commented on when I tweeted about this was a story that wasn't written about me. It was written about the head of our Board of Elections here in Kentucky, their executive director, and the calls they were getting and death threats they were getting. So it's not unique to the right or the left. The threats I've gotten on my person have been from the right, threats to remove me by force and so forth. Unfortunately, there's a lot of crazy out there, and it touches both sides.
Anybody want to weigh in on that? I mean, we're seeing a lot of crazy everywhere. Anybody want to weigh in on that? Was anybody surprised by it? Was I the only one who said, this is nuts? Anybody?
Yours. Go ahead.
The First Amendment that allows Amina and I to do our jobs and all the many great things about this country, unfortunately, gives folks an opportunity to say and do things sometimes you just have to scratch your head about. The intensity and the personal nature that I feel so many people, and Mr. Secretary, I think you're right, on the extreme left and on the extreme right. I mean, I think all of us in our respective fields are seeing it and feeling it and experiencing it. Sadiqa, I was out there on Saturday, and you just have to shake your head sometimes about the things that you see and the things that you hear, which is a different topic than what we're here about today, but it's still, to me, related in so many different ways. So it's unfortunate, Mr. Secretary, but I'm grateful for the fact that there was common ground found between you and the governor, and it is a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Sadiqa, I just wanted to ask you, because, we did have a lot of starlets from Hollywood, LeBron James, Ava DuVernay, and others who really chimed in on how the primary was ran in Kentucky. And at the same time, we know that COVID disproportionately impacts communities of color. So at the time when you're trying to protect communities of color, you've got Black Hollywood coming out and saying, Kentucky, you're doing it wrong. Which side were you on? Or did you see merit in both?
I absolutely saw merit in both. I think anything that keeps eyes on Kentucky is a good thing. I had no criticism for the stars that said what they said, because I think it helped Kentucky work to prove them wrong, and Kentuckians felt sort of attacked and wanted to go out. So I don't really care about that. I think anything that keeps attention on the issue is important, because people have no reason just to trust Kentucky politics. We're not really good at that. We do cheat. We do suppress, we do oppress. So it's okay if people push and then the good thing turns out. It's all right. So we won. That's great. People showed up. They did what they had to do, whether the election turned out the way they wanted it or not. They participated. And so that's the goal for me. So I'm never offended when people say their eyes are on Kentucky. We've earned the right to be criticized. That is not random criticism. And I saw all of the local journalists who were like, no, what are they saying? What are they saying? And I was chuckling because we were running people back and forth. We saw the traffic. I knew that we had sat on the phone trying to get mail-in ballots. So it is interesting for me when people who are not actually in community doing the work then say, oh, there's nothing to criticize. Believe me, there's room for improvement, but I certainly do appreciate where we have gotten to at this point. And I think, again, the secretary and governor are to be commended. I want to go back to the death threat thing. I think it's important. They have increased in my life. And so it's not just for elected officials. I try to remind people all the time that I am not some public person. I don't think I am. I mean, I run a little nonprofit organization with about 35 people. That's all we have. And for someone to take the time to handwrite a letter to me or to post on my social media that, which is the last thing they said, that the world would be better if I was dead. And then the next line said, could someone please take care of this? When officers say your name, sometimes it's not that the police themselves would actually hurt you, but people who follow them care and sometimes want to help them out. I point to Kenosha as there are young people and old who think they want to be helpful, and maybe being helpful would be to hurt one of us. And it is scary. I take it all seriously, mostly for my children, not necessarily for myself. And I told somebody last week, if you have never had your children described as soft targets, you don't quite understand what it is to be threatened. I do feel pretty fearless mostly, but I worry about others. And so I think it is important for us to deal with it. I also think it's important for us all, whether Democrats or Republicans, to push back on systems that threaten. And I think that's what happened. And we're not going to get into this a bunch, but if we're talking about voting, politics, all of that matters. You know, to have what happened in this community on Saturday, where you had very extreme, I think people who identify themselves as white supremacists, able to get to a location where you have pro-Black protesters and no police presence, when you've had police presence the entire 100 days of the protest. You've had police certainly have their eyes on that park. In fact, that day they had complained that there was a barbecue grill in the park. So to watch and then see things be allowed to happen, particularly after Kenosha, and you know, we have got to be concerned that all of our lives are protected and that we all can feel as safe as possible. But I certainly do appreciate, you know, the First Amendment and understand, you know, the role that it allows me to play. But I think we had better be careful about what we allow to happen in this country and in this community.
It almost feels like, though, we're heading into the abyss on certain things with civility and being able to talk and disagree and finding common ground. And I do think, Secretary, that's why when common ground was found on this, as Rick said, what an unexpected and pleasant victory it was. And I think a lot of people certainly feel that. I want to bring the audience back in for a couple more questions. So Renee, just to let you know, I'm going to go to question 2 for our audience, just to say, should there be more in-person polling places for the November 3rd elections? It's yes, no, undecided. If our folks in the audience on Zoom would go ahead and vote on that, and then we can get to a couple more of these questions too, Renee, if we want to.
Sure. And we should note that the compromise, Secretary Adams, that was struck with you and the governor, would call for at least one super voting center, I think is how you described it, super center, and you hope to have more, but it is also a local decision, right?
Thanks for bringing that up. So I don't like the word super center because it implies it's got to be a great big venue. What I wanted is to have at least one place in the county where any voter in that county could vote. And here's why. I've seen this every election I've been involved in since '92 when I first started. People who go to the wrong precinct, they moved or what have you, they go to the wrong precinct, they're not allowed to vote, they're just sent away, and then they don't vote. That's suppression too. It's not intentional, but that's the effect of it. By having a vote center in every county, by the way, this is an idea that I borrowed from Professor Douglas in his book. I introduced this in June, and we have it in November as well. At least one place in every county where every voter can go and know that they'll be on the rolls if they're registered to vote in that county. It makes it really convenient. It's hard to do that at every location because you got to have every possible ballot face. You might have hundreds of ballot faces in a particular county if you've got a lot of different cities in there and so forth. I think that's a really good thing to offer, though. I'm really proud of that. I want to make that permanent too.
All right, let's see if we can get the answer to that question. We'll take that down and see what the response is. Should be there more in person, overwhelming 85% yes, 2% no, 13% undecided. Renee, if you don't mind, I'm going to switch now to the third question because this was something that Rick had brought up. Should Kentucky polling hours be extended in the future? We talked about those from 6 to 6, and I think Secretary Adams even mentioned that. So let's let people weigh on that. And Renee, once we get the results, why don't you start the questioning on that? So should Kentucky polling hours be extended in the future? Yes, no, undecided. And we'll go ahead and see what the results are. And then Renee, you take it away on that.
So yeah, 90% say yes, no, 5% undecided, 5%. So Secretary Adams and Josh, is that a statutory change that could be made, or does that require a constitutional amendment to extend it beyond 12 hours, whether that's 6 to 6 or 7 to 7?
So the state constitution says 6 to 6. It was written that way back in 1892, but the Constitution allows the General Assembly to change that. I think they certainly could change it if they wanted to. I had a bill that did that. Unfortunately, in the aborted session, it didn't go anywhere. But I think at the least we should move the hours, maybe make them 7 to 7. I'd like to have them just longer, frankly, either more hours or more days or both, just to make this more convenient for people.
Yeah, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer. There's no reason to have the polls close as early as they do in Kentucky. Again, anything that we can do that improves convenience, that can improve turnout, that still has the safeguards that we think are important for election integrity are only a good thing. And let me actually, if you don't mind, let me address one other comment that I think Sadiqa had made about mail-in balloting, just because I want to make sure our audience hears this as well. And she said, she's encouraging people to drop their ballots off. There's going to be drop boxes in the various counties. But actually, I think at least in Kentucky, we don't have to worry about the Postal Service too much, at least until we're talking about the last week or so before the election. I know that the state boards have been in touch with the Postal Service. If every single voter in America sent their ballot in through the mail, it would still only be, I think it's 2% of all mail that the Postal Service processes. And so, and the other thing, as Secretary Adams pointed out, is that we have ballot trace, which is such an important feature. And so voters can go and essentially watch the progress of their ballot. So I recognize that, voters might feel more secure in dropping their ballots off to a drop box. But if you feel that it's easier for you or for whatever other reason you want to mail in your ballot, that's not necessarily, it doesn't mean your vote's not going to count.
Right. So let's take a pivot now and talk about something I know Sadiqa will have some strong commentary, I think, on, and that's the new photo ID law that takes effect, of course, for the general election. So Secretary Adams, real quickly, because I know we're running up on the clock here, anyone can vote in November without a photo ID, but a non-photo ID can fill out a reasonable impediment form, right? So that they can say that for some reason they could not have an ID provided. Is that inclusive enough? I think Joshua's going to say no, but your thoughts first.
Yeah, to put this in perspective, the version of Senate Bill 2 that I pushed for had a catch-all reasonable impediment. In English, that means that the voter could decide what their rationale for their inability to get a photo ID was. I'm proud of the fact that we appropriated $300,000 to give free IDs to poor people. I think that's a good thing. We tried to have a bill that was humane as possible. Unfortunately, the bill was written before the pandemic. I advocated that before they put it on final passage, if they go back to the catch-all reasonable impediment or have some sort of COVID impediment in there, they didn't. So I made that change myself through my emergency powers. I basically added that to the statute. So back to your question, if you don't have a photo ID, you can vote with a non-photo ID. That was the law before Senate Bill 2. You'll just need to sign a reasonable impediment form, which will have this excuse on it.
Joshua, real quickly before we ask Sadiqa and the others about photo ID.
Well, the changes that were made for this upcoming election are good because someone can say that COVID reasons are why they don't have an ID, and so they can use the form. And anyone using the online portal to request a mail-in ballot by providing their driver's license information, then that qualifies under the bill as well. So those changes are really great. You know, photo ID bills are not necessary in my view. They're what I call a solution in search of a problem, because the only kind of fraud they prevent is voter impersonation. And we just know as a factual matter that hardly ever, almost never happens. And so, you know, why have a voter restriction, a hurdle to vote when you're making it harder for some people with no benefit? That said, I think the Kentucky bill, because of a lot of the changes that were put in through the legislative process, has made this one of the most reasonable photo ID laws in the country. And so I think ultimately, although the law is not necessary, it has enough fail-safe measures in there that I think by and large, it's not going to harm. It's going to harm as few voters as I think possible as compared to a lot of other states.
And Professor Douglas, I remember during a legislative hearing that you said the in-person voter fraud happens less than a minuscule amount of time, I think you were quoted as saying. So voter fraud necessarily isn't something that this would get at. Sadiqa, Reynolds, I do want you to chime in on this issue because I know you've been very passionate about this as well.
I cannot communicate it more clearly than Professor Douglas has. I mean, why would we make it harder for some with no real benefit? We don't have records to show that we have any significant in-person voter fraud. There's no reason for the law. And this is what happens in Kentucky. This is the thing that worries me, is that we create a law we really shouldn't have, we really don't need. And then we say, but ours is the less, it's the least intrusive. It's the least, we shouldn't do that. We should just say it's unnecessary. We don't need it. We need to push to get rid of it, because somehow the other commentary gets lost in Kentucky. And so we end up with these things that we don't need, oppressing and pushing down people who really don't deserve that. We've really got to be more, and I'm going to use the term extreme here, and not extreme from a right or a left, but just extreme about this democracy that we are all desperately trying to protect, and making sure that we're not supporting or allowing the creation of rules and regulations that really make no sense, and they're not responsive to anything. I think that's really important for us.
And Rick,
can I just say this other thing too, from a transportation perspective? If someone wants to go get that ID, but they have COVID concerns, the very same reason why they wouldn't vote in person is the reason why they wouldn't go and get the ID in person. So I just wish we would get rid of the law.
All right, Rick and Amina, I'm going to have you weigh in, and then we're going to take a couple audience questions and then start getting some final thoughts here.
Yeah, I'll abstain from sharing my opinion on this, but I'll just raise the question of who is going to be most impacted by requiring the photo ID. I mean, that's the question we have to ask. Is it someone who doesn't really have an issue going out and getting a photo ID? Is that the person who's going to be concerned about it? Or is it going to be a person who's limited in resources, maybe limited in access for whatever reason, maybe has health issues at this point? And like the secretary said, a lot of the allowances that are in effect right now are just under emergency powers. So what's going to happen moving forward when we at some point, I assume, go back to normal life? Is it going to be the people who already have the most difficulty accessing their polling locations or their ballots? Is it going to be those people who are going to be most impacted by needing a photo ID that they may not have?
And Rick?
So go ahead, Rick.
I was just going to say, I'm just like Amina. I can't share a personal opinion on something like this since it's so out there in the news. But what I do reflect upon is, Rachel, how you started this conversation this evening, is the fact that we're 100 years since the passage of the 19th Amendment and the past 55 years of the Voting Rights Act. And you think about the energy, the lives that were devoted to empowering voters for the opportunity to cast that ballot. I mentioned before, there's nothing that's more important to the oxygen that keeps this democracy alive than casting a ballot. And I think that all of us as influencers and leaders in this community have a role to play, to be thoughtful about preserving the integrity of these elections, putting the appropriate guardrails around them, but doing all that we can to make it as easy as possible for people to go cast their ballot. We think that that's what those people who are in the generations before us would expect of all of us today.
So let's see what our audience thinks. Do you believe the new voter ID requirements will suppress voter participation. I believe they're going to bring up that question. There you go. And we'll get yes, no, or undecided. Do you believe the new voter ID requirements will suppress voter participation? We'll wait for those results to come in and move on to the fifth question.
Let's see what the answer is. 74% say they believe it will lead to voter suppression. Renee, I'm going to skip to the fifth question, and then we'll take a couple just from the audience and then get final thoughts from our panelists. Our fifth question, do you believe mail-in balloting will lead to voter fraud? Yes, no, or undecided? We'll see what our audience has to say about that. 8% say yes, 89% say no, 3% undecided. Anybody want to react to that, or?
Well, I can respond to Amina's question about who the photo ID law is going to affect, or at least I can speculate. Most of us, I presume all of us on this panel, and perhaps most of our audience as well, it's no big deal for them because we have driver's licenses, we carry our photo ID around in our wallets. So what we're talking about is the population that does not have a need for a photo ID law in their everyday lives. So we're talking particularly about poorer people who live in the inner cities. This tends to break more on minority communities because of those demographic breakdowns. You actually don't need, although it's much easier to live your life with a photo ID, you don't need to function in our society without one because, for example, people will say, well, you can't board a plane without a photo ID. Well, actually you can. The TSA has workaround regulations. And also, I'm not sure how many poor people who don't have an ID are getting on planes, even in non-pandemic times. People say, well, you need an ID to buy Sudafed. That's actually not true. The FDA has workarounds for pharmacists to use when someone comes and they need Sudafed, but they don't have a photo ID. So we have workarounds for every other situation, which is why I'm glad that SB 2 has workarounds for voters who don't have a photo ID as well. We know in some states that have a lot stricter laws, like Wisconsin and Texas, that up to 5 to 10% of the population does not have an ID. I think the impact will be a lot smaller here in Kentucky, given the workarounds that the law has, which is why I think it was so important that the legislature did include most of the suggestions that I had made during the legislation. And, Secretary Adams and I agree about the catch-all that he mentioned. And I was happy when it went into the bill initially, and then unfortunately it got stripped at the end. So I think it'll be a smaller impact in Kentucky, but remains to be seen.
All right, I'm going to ask just a couple audience questions real quick and just rapid fire answers. Why can't we have early in-person voting at all clerk's offices, post offices, and libraries? Secretary Adams?
I assume you mean no excuse early voting?
Just said, why can't we have early in-person voting?
Well,
No.
I guess the response to that is, okay, well, who's going to pay for it? The clerks don't have unlimited resources. Are they going to raise taxes at the county level to pay for it? Is the state going to raise taxes or cut healthcare education to pay for it? We live in a world of finite resources. I'm not advocating against it.
Adams, what is the price tag for that?
It just depends, but picture it this way. What's it cost to run election day? What's it cost to run 5 or 7 or 10 or 20 or 40 election days? Every time you add an election day, you increase your costs. You also distract the clerk's staff from doing taxes and the other things that they do. Again, that's not to say we shouldn't do it, but we should be honest about the fact that it's a government program and it costs money and it has to come from somewhere.
All right, let me ask you this, because I think a lot of people are perhaps willing to test the system right now. This person says a brother-in-law says he's going to vote with the mail-in ballot. Then he's going to vote in person to see if the mail-in ballot was valid. Is this legal?
No, and when we find this, we will pursue you. It's a Class D felony to do that. I recommend that people not do that.
All right, one other question. Can I request a mail-in ballot but then decide to vote in person?
We don't recommend that. You can, but you would have to cancel your application. There's some paperwork, and that would be risky, I think, on the voter's part if that isn't effectuated.
Okay. All right, Renee, do we want to start final thoughts? I'll let you lead us into that.
Yeah, so Amina and Rick, why don't you start us off as we're already at the 7 o'clock mark? If you just want to give us a real quick takeaway or what you're going to be looking for as we get to Election Day.
Go ahead, Amina.
Amina, you're muted. There you go.
I'm on the spot. All right. Well, I think a lot of what we're going to be looking for is not only how people participate, but how much trust they put in the system this year, because I think that that will really have implications for how we move forward and any potential changes we might see in future elections. You know, if things go really well and people say, this is great, let's make it work. And then you can start to have the conversations like Secretary Adams brought up about, you know, actual change and how you pay for a lot of that stuff. But the first step is going to be getting people to participate and feeling secure that their vote is counted.
And Rick Green, same question to you. Once you give people something, it's harder to take it away.
Sure is. Yeah. So obviously we'll be checking the participation, the safeguarding of the election and all the things that need to happen. But here's just a quick point that I will make here. We've been together for 62 minutes and there's not been a heated exchange. I have not received a single mean tweet. This has been a very thoughtful conversation, and my hope are these kind of conversations and the audience's participation. This is the kind of thoughtfulness in which we need to not only expand upon the success that we had in the primary, but also to preserve this democracy that we all care deeply about. And I just hope that there are folks that are in Washington that are watching us closely.
All right, Sadiqa.
Well, I think it's going to be really important for us to make sure we get the word out about how people can vote and when they can vote. A point was made, I think, by Secretary Adams and Professor Douglas that early voting doesn't really move the needle. And I would argue that mostly that's because a lot of people who should be voting early don't know that they can. A lot of the people who showed up at the doors of the fairgrounds and were banging on those doors did not understand that they could have voted early. We do not do a good job at getting the word out. So I heard that there was federal money for this election with COVID-19. I think we've got to make sure we're investing in marketing and communications to get the word out. And it really does need to be culturally competent. You know who we're going for and act like it. We've got to make sure that we are using PSAs and doing everything we can to get the word into the right group so that people are showing up to vote early, so that we don't even have to worry about the 6 p.m. deadline because we've already gotten people to vote. I think that's going to be extremely important for us.
All right, Josh, you want to weigh in, and then we'll have Secretary Adams with the final word there.
Sure, you're going to give him the last word. Jeez.
Well, I don't know. Flip a coin. What do you'll hash it out on Twitter long after this anyway.
You run next time, Josh.
All right. Three very quick points. One, to build upon what Rick said. You know, you may not be able to tell, but Secretary Adams and I actually disagree a bunch on various policies in terms of how we vote, and yet I think this conversation, the conversations he and I have had privately and publicly, the conversations he and Governor Beshear had, demonstrate how we should be doing things in an era of extreme polarization. And so I think, you know, this is a model, hashtag All Eyes in Kentucky, for the way we can have these conversations and make real progress. My second quick point is on the double voting. As Secretary Adams said, don't do it. It's a felony. Also, the system is set up to catch it. The system is set up to track your ballot, to check your signature. It's just a terrible idea. I wish our leaders had not suggested that, and it's only going to mess the system up more, and you will be caught. And then third, we may not know the results of elections. You know, we mentioned this earlier, that a lot of the counts can happen before or on November 3rd. We may have some results, but you know, we've actually, you know, the election is never final on election night. The announcement of winners is typically a media projection, and the election is not actually final until it's certified weeks later. And this year, you know, we may have better results in Kentucky, although if they're close races, we may not. But one thing we'll see is that, and this is just demonstrated in the scholarly literature, is that as the days after election day go on, there's what's called the blue shift. And what it is that Democrats tend to do better, or their vote totals tend to increase as the days after election day go on. And there's nothing nefarious about that. It's simply that the ways in which Democrats have been voting traditionally have those ballots counted later because they come in later or whatever else. So people should not be expecting necessarily, at least nationwide, an announcement of who wins the presidential election. And also, it's not any sort of fraud or surprise if we see the vote totals on November 3rd, the evening of November 3rd, are not the same, and the Democrats, whether they're talking about president or down ballot, start to do better on that night. That's actually the system counting every single ballot as it should be.
I have a question for Secretary Adams. I want to make sure I'm clear about something. For people who apply for a mail-in ballot and don't get it, you talk to us about voting in person, because I was almost in that situation. And I mean, I was 24 hours from having to just go vote instead of waiting on the mail-in ballot. So explain to me what should be done when that happens.
Sure. Yeah, this is an issue that we realized was not widespread, but we had instances of people who had applied and just never got their ballot. And so just a few days before the election, the governor and I on the board issued a new executive order and regulation to clarify that voters could vote in person if they demonstrated that they didn't get an absentee ballot. Obviously, we monitor to see if that ever comes in, and we don't count it. You can only vote once, of course. We mark it whether your in-person vote or your mail-in comes first. The default position is you have to cancel your absentee ballot application. And so that is still part of this process. There's some paperwork to fill out. To be clear, if you request your ballot and you never get it, you can still vote. You can vote in person. But we're not encouraging people to be willy-nilly and apply for a ballot they're not going to cast and then change their mind, because it just lengthens the lines at the polling locations, the more people that are having to do this paperwork. We want to protect this option for people who really need it.
So Secretary Adams, will let you add on to your final comments at this time, if you will.
Yeah, thanks. I'll go in a slightly different direction. I see the screen behind Rachel. Let's talk, bridging the divide. We really need that. Half the flack I've gotten is for the specifics of how this election looks, but the other half is, how could you work with Andy Beshear? How could you work with that tyrant, that Democrat? That's crazy. Andy Beshear won and I won, and people split their tickets. I know personally a lot of Adam Beshear voters, and I've got an obligation to work with him, and he's got an obligation to work with me. The voters gave the keys to people of different parties, and our system isn't prepared for 4 years of gridlock. We have to work together. I think my role is somewhat unique. Most of the constitutional officers, their roles they're more adverse to the governor and what they do, but my job literally is to work with the governor. I had to go to the legislature and ask them for that authority. And I did, and I'm glad I did, because ultimately what we got was an election system that both Democrats and Republicans believe is fair. If they just gave it to me to write it, the Democrats would cry foul. If they let the governor write it himself, the Republicans would cry foul, and rightly so. I think you get better government when people work together across the divide, because that way you get everyone's perspectives included and you can spot for any issues, and then the whole public can have confidence in the system.
Good words to end on, I think, Rachel.
I absolutely do. We want to give those important dates, Renee. I'll let you start there with Election Day, of course.
Election Day, of course, is November 3rd. How can we forget? And we hope that everyone will get out and vote. This screen of information is being sponsored by the National Council of Jewish Women, the Louisville section, so we appreciate them. And of course, the deadline, as you've heard, to apply for an absentee ballot is October 9th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. And you see the website on your screen there.
And then the deadline to register to vote, October 5th, you can go to JCJW Votes, turbovote.org to register. The National Council for Jewish Women also has additional voting information and resources. We thank them and all of our sponsors tonight, including Louisville Public Media, Wells Fargo, and our community partner, Lean Into Louisville. And Renee, final thoughts on where we can see you and watch you?
Okay, so shameless plug right here. We're going to start our candidate appearance October the 4th, but we'll have some great programs on education before then. But October 4th, we start our candidate appearances on Kentucky Tonight. And it will culminate with October 26th, the U.S. Senate candidates. The invitations have been extended, and we hope to hear from them. Brad Barron, the Libertarian, did qualify to participate, and we'll see if he accepts. And of course, Amy McGrath and Senator Mitch McConnell. So we'll see where that goes, and you can always watch us Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on KET and online at ket.org/KY Tonight.
And I want to bring that slide back up because we talked about civility and political discourse. And I want to let people know my panel discussion on October the 13th is called Why Can't We Talk Anymore? Are civil conversations even possible anymore? I would say tonight It was very civil and very enjoyable. So yay. Senators Julie Rocky Adams, Morgan McGarvey, Representative Charles Booker, along with Lisa Schultz, the superintendent of schools with the Archdiocese, and Chandra Irvin from Spalding will be joining me for that conversation. I hope there's no shouting like the graphic right there. Also, if you'd like to donate to the Frazier, you can do that by visiting fraziermuseum.org/donate. And Renee, thank you so much. And our panel, fantastic conversation, really. Most appreciated. And Secretary Adams, we love that there was bridging the divide in this instance. And Rick, I think you said it at the very beginning, when the voters win, I think that's a good thing. And as Sadiqa said, we still have a ways to go, but it seems like we all agree that this was a really good first step. So Renee, I'm letting you have the final word here tonight.
Go vote, but just do it one time.
Yay!